I wanted every listener to know, Christian or not, primarily non-Christian, that rejecting Jesus comes with a cost that is so great that you don't want to suffer it. On the flip side, to your question, that receiving Jesus will bring clarity to why you're here and what you ought to be on about. It's faithfully, in a sense, entering into his vineyard and doing his work, getting on with his mission.
How has an interest in expositional preaching grown? And how do you teach someone to do it?
In this episode, we continued our conversation with David Helm, senior pastor of Christ Church Chicago. And we spoke to him specifically about the Charles Simeon Trust, an organization he founded over 20 years ago in order to equip others in the work of expositional preaching.
We also spoke to David about how he employed these principles in a sermon he gave recently on Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 to 46, the parable of the tenants in the vineyard. In addition to this, we discussed preaching on gospels more generally, how to deal with Old Testament allusions, and the gospel work that God has prepared for all believers to do. This sermon was released prior to this episode, and you can listen to it wherever you listen to this podcast. My name's Tiff Carter-Whitley.
And my name's Leo Elborn, and this is the Bible Matters podcast, encouraging faithful Bible teaching and ministry. David Helm, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be back. I love you guys and I love what you're doing over there.
It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. David, can I ask, first of all, what is your prayer whenever you come to preach a passage?
I could do clever answers like, Lord, help me. But there was a story of a guy who hadn't done any preparation. And so he's going up into the pulpit and he keeps praying, Lord, help me, Lord, help me, Lord, have mercy, Lord, have mercy. And the voice thunders from heaven, you didn't prepare, you won't hear from me now. So what am I praying for? I'm praying that the lives of my listeners would have a personal encounter with God in all his glory in ways that their lives would be transformed in and through the gospel. So I'm praying for what I would call the preaching moment, that the Spirit of God would be at work within the people who are present through the word proclaimed in all of its weakness in ways that would transform lives and fulfill God's purposes. Yeah, that's what I'm praying for.
David, we're here today to talk to you specifically about a talk you preached in Matthew chapter 21, part of your series on Matthew. But before we get to it, I'd love to just talk to you a little bit more about your work and your story, and in particular about the Charles Simeon Trust. So I think you are the founder and executive director of the Charles Simeon Trust. Can you just give us a sense, in a nutshell, what is the Charles Simeon Trust?
Oh, yeah. I'd love to do it, especially for your audience. Many of them might know it, but originally we were a knockoff of the Proclamation Trust. I met Dick Lucas in 1990-91. I invited him. Kent Hughes and I did back 3 or 4 times in the 90s to help us. Started with about 8 of us trying to handle the Bible better. We did it informally without an organization. We eventually landed on small groups and texts and interactions, large group sessions. We just adopted a model. At about the 10-year mark, we probably had about 100 people coming and many pastors from other parts of the country. And they're like, hey, we should do this where we live. So the founding of the Simeon Trust was simply financial leverage to enable what is a 2.5-day preaching workshop to be pulled off in multiple locations. So I wrote the stuff up along with my brother-in-law, John Dennis. We came up with a purpose statement on training people to better handle the Bible. Sent my documents off to Dick Lucas and Kent Hughes, got their input, and off we went. That was January of 2001. So now what are we? It's 20, I guess we're 23 years old. We'll do 154 preaching workshops around the world this year.
Wow.
2.5-day events. We'll probably be in front of 7,000 to 8,000 pastors and Bible teachers with these on-site kind of things. There'll be another 6,000 to 8,000 doing online work. And we've started a Chicago course on preaching as kind of a residential model. So that's a bit, but I guess I just want to say the Lord was kind enough to have me not only learn pastoral ministry under Kent Hughes, but then be equipped on handling the word in kind of a growing manner through my friendship with Dick Lucas. And that's the roots of the trust come from there.
So there's, I guess, something of a captive audience each year. Can you just give us a sense of what it is that you are trying to teach people through the work of the Charles Simeon Trust?
Sure. Principles that, if put into play in their personal Bible study preparation, would naturally enable them to make progress in their rightful and hopefully effective use of the word, which is different than homiletics, different than simply talking about skills. So yeah, these are well-tested principles that keep you on track, that help you. And we call it spring training. I don't know what you guys think about that, but I don't know where your cricket teams go or your rugby teams or your football teams, but for our country, every baseball team right now, today, in fact, they all leave and they go to either Florida or Arizona and they kick off spring training. So spring training, whether you're a future Hall of Famer, whether you're a rookie trying to make the team for the first time, you go away for like 3 weeks and you just work on fundamentals.
Okay.
These are things you might have done since you were 7, you might have learned how to go off the pitching mound, pick up a baseball, pivot, throw to first base. They're all doing it. They're working on the fundamentals. My dad was a coach in the National Basketball Association, the NBA.
Oh, wow.
And every Hall of Famer he's ever coached or everything they've ever done, the best athletes work on the basic fundamentals all the time.
Yeah.
But for some reason, you get pastors, they go to school once, they think they're okay, and they never go back to work on it. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get Bible teachers back to the basic fundamentals in ways that will enable us to actually make progress.
Can you tell us how you do that? How do you teach them to study the Bible and then teach it?
Yeah, how do we do it? So I'm going to answer it pedagogically. So pedagogically, I think there are 3 prongs that together accomplish that. Bible teachers need instruction. In other words, there's a certain amount of content. They need to be told something about what principles they should be using. And I would go even further, that the instruction can't be lecture. It shouldn't be, let me give you my best stuff on Matthew. It's not transference of information. It's the process of self-discovery. So one of the brilliant things about learning is when you begin to see things for yourself. So we don't do it simply by advocating for biblical exposition, because advocating for exposition only advocates for it. You're not equipping anyone until you're working with them on their own work and working with them in a way where they have self-discovery. So pedagogically, it's Socratic. It depends on self-discovery.
It's more of what is it? Teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a day. No,
absolutely.
Give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And so that's why small groups are critical, because you're actually working with Bible teachers on their own work. They have to come with preparation. And then there's a third element where we just have short sermons. So instructional sessions, small group practice, and then sermons, because when you actually are under the word of God preached, these aren't model sermons. We don't dissect them. We just feed the people that are there. Often when someone preaches and I'm under the word, that convinces me again that I need to do the word. So that's how we do it. We put together principle instruction, small group practice, and the act of preaching. And you put that in a cauldron and you stir that stuff around.
Oh, that sounds really great.
Yeah, not only have we found people want to drink it, but it actually helps them make progress. We should probably say something about Charles Simeon himself. I mean, he's 54 years there at Holy Trinity. He's buried in King's College Chapel. You go into the chapel, take a left-hand turn, you'll see the initials. I mean, he's underneath the ground there waiting for the resurrection. What was the influence of Charles Simeon? The influence of Charles Simeon was certainly known in his day, but the influence of Charles Simeon extends to the convictions he held, the people he trained, and an awareness that the gospel continues to move. I think that's a bit for us too. I think expositors are better known for their convictions than their capacity to do it well. If we've had influence, it's because of our convictions. And I could give you all kinds of stories, but I'll just give you a category. I talk with people all over the world who remember when the penny dropped for them and it set the course of their ministry for the next 30 years. I just got a letter last week from someone that just retired from ministry. I met this person back in 2001 at one of our first workshops we did. And he wrote me this week to say, 22 years later, I'm retired, and you have no idea the influence that this work has had in our area, in my ministry, and what it's doing around the world. So, we take pleasure in that, but I like to keep us on mission. I don't really have too much time to celebrate, or we just want to keep going,
David, I hope you don't mind me asking too much about your prayer life, given I asked you at the start what you pray before you're about to preach, but what is your prayer for the future of the Simeon Trust?
Yeah, great question. Because we are 23 years old, so we're not young. Hopefully we're not old. I guess I'm just going to give you 2 words and then we can talk about it for a minute. My prayer for the future is that we would continue to help people, train people. So that would be the word.
Train people.
That we would never lose the singular focus of training people to handle the Bible. And then I think the other one for me would be, I want to stay true. I want to stay true to the gospel, true to the fidelity of the word. But I also want us to be, I want ministers and Bible teachers who are in this kind of little circle of the Simeon Trust to not fail. I don't mean fail in their exposition. Just look at it this way. Movements. There have been a lot of people on mission. They're part of a movement. They build a monument. They only think about the past as a memory, and they're on their way to being a mausoleum. So my prayer for trust is that we be able to keep turning the dial back to stay on mission. And there's a lot of things that can derail that. I mean, you've seen it in the Church of England. We've seen it in evangelicalism. The wake of moral, ethical, ministerial failure can derail the mission that God's given us to do. And so I pray for protection, if you want to put it that way. Yeah. I'm praying for training. I'm praying for, let's say, true. And I'm praying for protection. That's what I'm praying for.
That's good. I guess the devil probably isn't seeking people to have technically less good exegesis. But like you say, he wants people to sin and he wants people to fall away from Jesus.
Yeah. And I think what we have to remember is that happens on 2 ends of the spectrum, right? So we're famous for saying that churches are closing around our countries because they've given themselves to Protestant liberalism, social gospel, etc. But let's remember, Christ walks in the midst of the churches, the lampstands, and he threatens to close the door of churches that are doctrinally correct, but have lost any love or ethical understanding that what we say and how we live actually moves together. So God is in the business of closing down works, closing down churches on the full range of the theological spectrum. And we've got a big enemy. We've got to keep praying.
Absolutely.
Episode, we're looking at one of your talks in this Matthew series. As we've said, it's the parable of the tenants from Matthew 21, verses 33 to 46. Can we begin with you just sharing with us how you applied the exegetical principles that you teach in the Simeon Trust to this passage?
Sure. That particular text demanded the principle of context in kind of I don't want to say heavy-handed way, but in a time-consuming way. I mean, there are 3 massive elements in there related, if I remember correctly. There's a quotation from Psalm 118. There's an allusion to Daniel 2. There's a convictional, almost metaphor on the vineyard that requires your understanding, at least for someone who hasn't read the Bible, that these tenants are actually in reference to Israel and her teachers. So I'm hoping, well, for better and worse, one of the challenges of that sermon was dealing with biblical context, the literary context. So the way I tried to do literary context as far as a principle, that sermon comes in the middle of a teaching section where he's entered into the temple, but he's now challenged, resisted, and he's teaching against the scribes and the Pharisees. The literary context means that this sermon is going to move against something, not merely for something. And that's certainly a challenge that I think, as far as principles. So I think those would be the 2, I think all the context issues were critical to deal with on that particular sermon. How do you handle biblical context? That is, how do you handle literary context? And we could get into it. I mean, my gosh, how do you handle cultural context? Because my people had no idea about anything going on in context.
And as you say, that is time consuming. You've got a big chunks of context there. Whole Bible and the section. Yeah. But
too much,
it's worth
to be honest with you. Too much.
Yeah.
Well, it can be worth it because some people think that preaching is simply helping people put their Bible together. I think it's a derivative of preaching over time, but I'm kind of reticent normally to have people run all over the Bible. I'd like to stay in my text, but this one probably was more demanding on that sort.
Can I just ask you, in the last episode, you talked a bit about the context of Matthew, and you've alluded to it there. And I'd love to ask you something I listened to on your podcast, actually, on Preacher's Talk. Really fantastic podcast. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts. One of the things
we're still having fun.
Still having fun. That's good. One of the things that was said was Gospels are perhaps the most tricky genre to preach, or at least to preach well. Why do you think that?
Well, because all of the types of scripture are coming together. It's just like muddy water. So you've got poetry, you've got discourse, you've got narrative, you've got all these things happening. You've got promise and fulfillment, and you've got these parables too, right? So, I mean, the text we're talking about, even with these tenets, how do you handle the point of a parable, the point of this parable? Well, how is it different? How is this parable on tenants, which is next to a parable on a wedding? How is it to be handled differently than 2 chapters later, where you have a parable related to working in the field and going out to get people to come to a wedding? I mean, you got to handle all those distinctions.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes it both enjoyable, invigorating, and difficult.
Yeah, sure. And can I ask particularly about this passage then? So again, famous parable, owner of a vineyard goes away, leaves tenants in charge. They don't do a great job. They do a fairly murderous job. One of the things I noticed about your talk is that you didn't spend time really, I guess, deciphering what the metaphors or the parable was about, but you actually just really went to town on the details. You kind of tried to give like a multi-sensory image of what the vineyard would be like, what it would smell like, reminded us of your trips to South Africa and Italy and other exotic places. You told us what a wine press was going to be like. Why did you choose to do that in this talk?
Yeah, really great question, because I don't do that all the time. These are matters for my audience of cultural context. So there are details in the text that would have been known by those in the text, the characters in the text, but not necessarily known by the readers of the text, and in all likelihood, not known at all by the people to whom I'm speaking. And the people that come here to university or live in the city, we're no longer in an agrarian world.
Yeah,
I'm guessing most of my people would have to Google to find out what a wine press is.
Yeah.
So there's an element of extended time in this message on matters that I felt I wanted them to have a sensory understanding of the story itself. The other thing is, and I got this from John Woodhouse, rightly or wrongly, brilliant preacher of narrative. Expositional preaching is never afraid to get into what I call the terrain of the text. In other words, the beauty of the scripture at points isn't simply deriving a principle from the text. There are points where the beauty is in the detail of the terrain of the text. And that probably captured me a little bit on this one. The terrain, the natural terrain of the story. I wanted my people to experience that terrain, and therefore some of the detail.
I think you did that in pulling out all the details. You said you had a line to summarize it saying the owner left the vineyard expecting it to do brilliantly. He'd done everything possible. And actually pulling out all those details meant that when we saw what happened in the end, the murder, the fall was greater.
Yeah.
Because we'd had all those details.
I'm glad you picked up on that, because we don't do detail for detail's sake.
Sure.
I'm not doing information for information's sake. I'm doing the information for, in that sense, the sensory load payoff of this owner provided everything necessary to succeed.
Now, David, you've already brought up the fact that there was lots of context to consider with this talk. So we had the Psalms, Isaiah, and Daniel. How did you feel that going to each of those places in the Old Testament, how did they aid your talk? What did they bring out that you wouldn't have had if you hadn't gone there?
I think I would probably even expand your question. Not only how did they aid it, but how did they hinder it? I think there was a young woman in our church who was a Christian and came to me afterwards and said, one of the reasons I love coming here is the connections are made with the scriptures. So it's not just a metaphor, but you actually locate it in Isaiah 5. So there is a hunger for the fullness of the scriptures from particular texts that I think just can aid. And I also think it's required at times for someone that's unfamiliar with this. You had to be able to move from a metaphor to the fact that Jesus is speaking against Israel as a failed tenant, the leaders in particular. So I almost feel like it demanded that I sort out the Isaiah 5. But I'll be quite honest with you. All of these things 3 times in one sermon, the Psalm 118, and then I think there's elements where it hinders as well, that you begin to get diminishing returns, that you might do more than you should have, that perhaps one textual referent was enough. And if so, should it have been Psalm? Should have been the Psalm. Part of that's my audience. My audience doesn't know. But yeah, I don't know. I'm sure it aided it in some points, but I also feel personally like, that also can provide density, density to the loaf of bread that is more than makes the congregant hungry to eat more.
I found the Isaiah one really helpful, actually. And I know it's quite an obvious one that it's a reference to Isaiah 5, but I think it actually really helps me when I flicked up Isaiah 5. That is the idea of the Lord's coming to his vineyards in that psalm. And obviously, as a result, Matthew's making like a really significant comment about Jesus. This is the Lord's coming to judge. I found.
You know what? I think you've hit on something really important there. I think Matthew's argument, I came across this maybe a text or two later than what you're observing there. There's a text where he finishes his stuff in the temple saying, well, whose son is David? If he's calling his Lord, then whose son is he? What I realize is Matthew 1, I normally think Matthew 1, the genealogy is proving that Jesus rightly descended from the line of David. But actually Matthew's understanding is not only did Jesus descend from the line of David, but the line of David descended from him. He is the ultimate son of David. And in the same way that you're picking up, not only is the Lord coming to the vineyard, but Matthew is trying to say that Jesus is that eternal Lord and the kingdom rightly belongs to him. Wow, that's a potent thing if you could actually get that across to a listener.
Well, you got it across to me, so thank you.
I don't know.
And I'd love to ask, it struck me from this talk that once again, like the last one, you had a very plain message. And again, I actually thought of it this morning on my commute to work. You said there will be earth-shattering consequences for those who reject Jesus. It's a pretty heavy line. I guess for non-Christians listening, there's quite an obvious implication of that.
Yeah.
But what about the Christians in your congregation listening? How did you want them to understand that truth?
Yeah, great question. Because both sides of the coin have to come out in preaching. And so I guess I would put it this way to start. I wanted every listener to know, Christian or not, primarily non-Christian, that rejecting Jesus comes with a cost that is so great that you don't want to suffer it. On the flip side to your question, that receiving Jesus will bring clarity to why you're here and what you ought to be on about. It's faithfully, in a sense, entering into his vineyard and doing his work, getting on with his mission. So I wanted the Christian to be encouraged by this text, that by receiving him, you now know what you're supposed to be doing, and you should actually live with greater clarity than before you listen to this talk.
Hey everyone, this is Leo from the Bible Matters podcast, and I really hope you're enjoying this episode and you're finding it helpful. Just a very short message from me to say thank you for listening. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, we'd love it if you could give us a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if possible, a couple of comments or a review. All of these things really do help us to reach new listeners. And if you've been helped by any of these podcasts or any of the resources featured on Bible Matters, we would love it if you could consider becoming a financial partner with us. There's no pressure at all, but so far, this podcast has been funded entirely by the generous gifts of our listeners. And if you feel you could support our work and the work of this show, there are details on how you can partner with us in the description and show notes of this episode. I really hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. David, in your talk, you had this line. You said, "Is Jesus getting the fruit of your seasons?" And you mentioned in the talk about how instead of rejecting Jesus, we need to be workers in his vineyard. It's something that the Pharisees failed at. Can you just explain what is that work that you're talking about?
Yeah, let me be clear. Through the voice of Matthew's gospel, the work is the making of disciples. So that's going to be the charge that he puts on his most intimate followers as he sends them into the vineyard of the whole world. So I would say the work of the Christian is laboring for the growth of the kingdom through the making of disciples.
So that's quite interesting because you've used the context of Matthew, and particularly, I guess, the last few verses of Matthew 28 as the frame through which you understand what Jesus is talking about here.
Yeah, and I can tell you why. Again, there's about 4 or 5 parables that deal with this vineyard agrarian imagery in Matthew. And here, the locus of this parable is on those who reject him. But in a couple chapters' time, he's going to have the parable on the talents. And the talents are now you're talking about the private discourse of Jesus after he leaves the temple for the last time. And he now is going to kind of take all these parables, the wedding, the guy that couldn't get into the wedding, and these people that reject the son as the tenants. And he's going to flip that public discourse into private discourse for his followers related to fidelity with what he's given you to do, which is different than just go fill your vocational calling.
Yeah.
I mean, it's different than, every person has something to do, and whether you're washing a table or, whatever, the priesthood of all believers. No, it's different. It's for the kingdom. It's actually furthering the kingdom, which he's going to say happens through the making of disciples.
No, that's really helpful. I guess it's maybe easy to fall into the trap that we're called to work in the vineyards, and that means, go make the world a better place, pick up some litter, trim the hedges. But actually the proper understanding is Matthew and Jesus want us to go out and make disciples.
Yeah. So so we're talking to the choir on that, right? I mean, because your world and my world are the same. We are concerned, I think rightly, that people are confused on what is the primary mission of the church. And so therefore, in your environment and in my environment, we're going to lean into the making of disciples through the proclamation of the word, in contrast to, like you mentioned, trimming hedges or something. But, and you're right, but I would also say to us in the choir, that when he says they're making of disciples, he also demonstrates through the participles the means by which that occurs. While going, make disciples, teaching them, which is usually where we stop. That's our mission. Teach the Bible, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded. So the actual, what we're worried about, we have to also at least acknowledge that what he wants from us is the making of disciples, that is men and women who don't just believe something, but live well under his rule. You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
We want to live well as his followers. I only say that because I'm in total agreement with where you would lean into this and where I normally lean into this. But I also don't want us to neglect that the gospel, the euangelion, is always connected to the ethics of that kingdom. That the Passover in Exodus 12 of substitutionary atonement is connected to an annual celebration that says you have to live this out. That Jeremiah 31 that talks about the new covenant is connected to the way we relate a table to one another as the greatest or the least. And so I'm with you, and I also want us to not be afraid to lean into more than merely, did I teach you the Bible?
Yeah.
But did I teach you to obey? Did I teach you to live out the ethics of the Lord that we follow.
The work is not done when people get something or even when they profess for the first time, but the work is done when the Lord returns and there are holy lives to display.
Yeah, and I'm well aware of the critique, right? So I'll get critiqued that, oh, you're a Bible teaching church. You're just concerned that people understand the Bible. And I'm like, okay, let me listen to that critique for a bit. Let me learn what I can. Let me make sure that to the best of my ability, I'm not going to be subject to that critique in an unhealthy way.
Now, David, you're pastoring a church in Chicago. Can you tell us what you think are maybe some of the bigger ways that Christians there might get distracted from this work?
Oh my gosh. Like London, Chicago is fast-paced, in motion. People come here for education. They come here for vocation. They have an agenda on their way in, and they don't necessarily think that the gospel sits at the center of all those activities. In other words, they moved here for school. They didn't move here for Jesus. And so distractions are plenty. I mean, on the lowest end, cities are great, but they also demonstrate, I think the way Ellis Peters put it, the novelist, they have the full range of good and evil. So you can get anything you want in London.
Yeah.
Anything. And therefore, everything can distract you. And Christians can be distracted. I'd be hard pressed to say here are the top 3 distractions. Sure. Because I actually think it's more in line with your dispositional makeup. Education can distract you. Vocation can distract you. Family can distract you. Pleasure can distract you. Yeah.
I guess on the flip side, have you seen the gospel change lives of the people that you are ministering to, how they're really getting into this gospel work?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in ministry now, ordained ministry, since like 86, 88. So coming up on the better part of 4 decades. I was just on the East Coast. Someone had heard that I was there. I didn't know that they were even there anymore. They texted me or emailed me and said, you don't know this, but we were in your church when we were in the university. We'd like to have you for dinner.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's so lovely.
I went. I had to even kind of refresh myself on who am I going to see? And they tell the story of not only meeting, this was a married couple with children, not only meeting at church, but how he had come in as a kind of nominal Christian, but she didn't have any real personal faith at all, how she came to Christ. These people are active in their church. They're vital members. And, this, and 20 years has gone. One of the great things about being in a big city like yours or mine is that people are always coming at formative years of life and then going all over the world, almost like deployment. And so there are hundreds and hundreds of stories of people that have left this place, and yet the gospel has held them and God is using them all over the world. I love that. That's just men and women. That doesn't go to the fact that, we've had over 90 ministerial interns, many of which kind of move into kind of full-time vocational ministry. So it isn't just limited to who left us and became a pastor or a Bible teacher. But yeah, the Lord is using local churches in difficult, large contexts to get done what he wants all over the world. I love it. Don't you love it?
Yeah,
I do love it. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? You rarely see the fruits of your labor. I mean, Charles Simeon was universally hated in his life, I think.
Yeah.
But, now because of his work, I can't remember the figures he said, 8,000 or something like that, people learning how to teach the Bible. David, if you could preach this passage again, what would you change?
Let me say something about myself rather than the passage. I was gifted with a very little rearview mirror and a big windshield. I don't spend too much time trying to figure out what I would change or do again differently. Most times when I preach or teach the Bible, I get done and go, well, okay, that was that, and move on.
Yeah.
Rarely do I write something on my notes like, if you're going to do this again, remember X, Y, or Z. So I really don't know how to answer that question other than to say the Word of God is living, active, and even at my worst efforts, wherein there might be many things to change, I'm not overly concerned about it. I'm just on to the next thing.
David, it has been so wonderful chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, it's been great to be with both of you. I just have a great love and appreciation for your works, and grateful to at least reconnect in ways that might be beneficial for some.
We're super grateful.
Thank you so much, David.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bible Matters podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not like, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcast? All of this really does help us to reach new listeners. The Bible Matters project is funded entirely by the generous gifts of our listeners. And if you yourself would like to become a financial partner with us, you can find more details on how to give in the show notes. The Bible Matters podcast is an initiative of St. Helens Bishopsgate and is created by myself, Tiff Carter-Whitley, along with Leo Elborn. Thanks again for joining, and we hope to see you again soon.